The planet Velkara smelled like burnt copper and wet ash, a dying world that had seen too many wars and never enough mercy. Sergeant Damon Hale stood at the edge of a crumbling courtyard and looked up at the grey sky above the garrison. The clouds were thick and low, and they pressed down on everything like a heavy hand that had grown tired of holding itself up. Below the ridge, the ruins of a Varelsai settlement stretched out in broken lines across the valley floor, silent and cold, and the wind that moved through it carried the smell of old fires and nothing else. He was not a remarkable-looking man, medium height, dark eyes set into a face that 14 years of military service had weathered into something steady and hard to read. He was not the loudest soldier in any room, and he was not the biggest, but there was something behind his eyes that made people take a second look, something that suggested a person who had decided, a long time ago, that giving up was simply not a language he spoke. The garrison was a coalition outpost, built into the frame of an old relay station on the edge of the contested zone. It was home to soldiers from 6 different species living in close quarters and polite tension. There were Varelsai officers with their silver bones and quiet eyes, a squad of thick-bodied Oran fighters, a pair of Thelk engineers who argued constantly in their clicking language, 2 Drevany scouts who said almost nothing to anyone, and 8 humans that Damon led with steady hands and very few wasted words. Most of the alien soldiers kept a respectful distance from the humans, not out of hostility but out of something closer to careful uncertainty. Humans were genuinely difficult to understand, and the galaxy had not yet decided what to make of them. They formed attachments too fast, they pushed against limits that every other species accepted as fixed, they treated hope like a tool instead of a feeling, and they had a deeply unsettling habit of refusing to let things go even when letting go was clearly the only rational option. The Varelsai were the oldest and most respected species in the garrison, tall and angular, with silver bones that showed faintly through pale translucent skin, and eyes the color of winter moons. They moved with the deliberate grace of a people who had been alive long enough to stop being in a hurry. Their entire civilization had been built around a single idea, that all things ended, and that a wise and mature being learned to accept those endings without fighting them. Death was not a failure to the Varelsai, it was a destination, and they approached it with ceremony and composure and a dignity that most humans found deeply uncomfortable to be around. Damon had great respect for the Varelsai. He simply disagreed with almost everything they believed about death. He turned away from the courtyard and walked the narrow stone corridor that led to the medbay. His boots were quiet on the floor and his face was still, but his mind was already ahead of him, already in the room he was walking toward. The medbay was small and cold and lit by the pale blue wash of medical equipment. It hummed with the soft sound of machines doing quiet, careful work, and in the center of it, on a raised platform surrounded by monitors and tubes, Commander Ethan lay still and faded. She was Varelsai, the last surviving officer of her division after the ambush on the eastern ridge 3 days ago. She had led her soldiers into that fight with the controlled precision that came from decades of command, calm under fire, clear in her orders, the last one standing when the enemy deployed the weapon. The neurodecay agent had caught her in the final seconds of the engagement, a small hit at her shoulder that had looked like almost nothing at the time. 3 days later she was barely there. The neurodecay weapon worked by coming apart the neural architecture from within. It did not destroy the body, it dissolved the connections that held a mind together, one thread at a time, until the person inside simply stopped being a person. Every medical record the Coalition had on the weapon ended the same way. The outcome was not a question, only a matter of when. Elder Sorvith, the senior Varelsai officer in the garrison, had come that very morning and performed the first stage of the rite of accepted ending. He had placed a silver cloth across Ethan's hands and spoken the old words in a low and measured voice, and the other Varelsai present had bowed their heads and received what was happening with the patient. Sorrowful grace of a people who had been practicing acceptance for 3,000 years. Damon had stood in the doorway and watched the whole ceremony with his arms crossed and his face perfectly still. He pulled a chair close to her platform now and sat down, not dramatically, not with any kind of speech. He just sat there, the way a person sits when they are not willing to be anywhere else. The Varelsai medic Tail came into the room after a while and stopped when she saw him. She looked at him with the careful and curious expression that most of the alien soldiers used when they were trying to understand something about humans that none of the data logs had managed to explain. "Sergeant Hale," she said gently, "she cannot perceive you. The decay has reached her upper processing architecture. There is no surface awareness remaining at this stage." Damon looked at Ethan's face. Even now, even dimming and quiet, there was something in it that looked like someone who had commanded armies and had meant every single order she had ever given. "I know," he said. "Then why are you here?" Tail asked. She was not being unkind, she was genuinely asking. He was quiet for a moment, Because she is, he said. Tail had nothing to say to that. She checked the monitors, made her notes, and left him there. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, he brought nothing and said very little, just sat beside her and occasionally spoke in a low voice about small things, the weather outside the window, a repair that needed doing on the east wall, a video his daughter had sent him from Earth of her first time riding a bicycle, a video he had watched at least a dozen times on nights when the work felt too heavy. The alien soldiers noticed. The humans understood it in their quiet way. The Varelsai watched it with a mix of confusion and something they could not name. On the third evening, Elder Sorvith himself came to the corridor outside the medbay and stood before Damon with the still and composed bearing of someone who had lived long enough to have run out of surprises, but there was something uncertain in his pale eyes. Your care for Commander Ethan is seen and respected, Sorvith said carefully. But what you are resisting is not a problem. It is a passage. To resist it is to work against the peace that has already been given to her. Damon met the Elder's eyes directly and held them. With respect, Elder, he said. She did not choose this. She is not at peace. She is just running out of time. And those are not the same thing. Sorvith was silent for a long moment. You are a very unusual species, he said at last. I've heard that, Damon said. That evening in the blue-violet hour when Velkara's sun dropped behind the ridge and the garrison went dim and quiet, Damon leaned forward beside Ethan's platform and spoke in a low and steady voice. I don't know how much you can hear from wherever you are right now, he said. But I need you to hold on. I don't know what I'm looking for yet, but I am going to look, and I am going to find something. One of the monitors showed a small and irregular spike in her neural output. A flicker, a ghost of a signal, there for a second and then gone. Damon looked at it. Then he looked at her face. There you are, he said quietly. He stood and walked out of the medbay with the stride of a man who had made a decision that could not be unmade. Somewhere below in the garrison's lower level, a doctor named Yeva Oren was about to receive a late-night visitor who did not know how to take no for an answer, and the alien soldiers who passed Damon in that corridor and looked at his face would say afterward, in their various languages, that there had been something in his expression they did not have a word for. Something that looked like a war that had not started yet but already knew it was going to win. Dr. Yeva Oren did not look like someone who held the line between life and death in her hands. She was short and sharp-eyed. With dark hair she had not properly brushed in what appeared to be several days, and she worked in a lab on the garrison's lower level that smelled permanently of chemical solvent and cold coffee. Her desk was invisible under stacked data screens and printed field reports, and the walls were covered in diagrams that she had drawn herself in marker when the official documentation had not been detailed enough to satisfy her. She was also the only person within 4 star systems who had been secretly studying the neurodecay agent for 2 full years, not because she had been assigned to it but because she had decided, on a battlefield in a different system where she had watched 3 soldiers dissolve from the inside over the course of a week, that no weapon this precise and this brutal should exist in the galaxy without someone somewhere trying to understand it. Damon found her at her desk just past midnight. She had 3 screens running and a cup of something that had stopped being warm a long time ago. He sat down across from her without apology for the hour. I need everything you know about neurodecay, he said. Right now. Oren looked at him over the top of her screen with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit for 2 days. Ethan, she said. Yes. Damon, the data on this is. I know what the data says, he told her. I need to know if it's the only version. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned one of her screens to face him and started talking. What she had was incomplete and scattered. Fragments pulled from restricted databases, field observations from 3 different war zones, and one very unusual paper written by a xenobiologist who had published it quietly and then disappeared from the academic record entirely, but taken together. What the fragments suggested was something that did not fit the standard narrative. The neurodecay weapon was not entirely irreversible. It was irreversible under standard conditions with standard treatment, but there were outliers. 3 documented cases where the decay had slowed significantly without any known medical intervention, and in all 3 of those cases there was one shared variable that had not been taken seriously because it did not fit inside any existing medical model. In all 3 cases, Oren said, pulling up the files and spreading them across the screens, the patients had prolonged and consistent close-range exposure to a compatible neural presence. Someone physically near them, 4 hours at a time, over multiple days. Damon thought about the monitor spike, that small and irregular flicker in Ethan's readings on the evenings he had sat beside her. What kind of compatible? He asked. That's the part we don't fully understand, Oren said carefully. But in all 3 documented cases, the compatible presence was human. The lab was quiet for a moment. just the hum of the screens and the distant sound of the garrison settling into the night. There is something in human neural resonance, she continued, something in the frequency pattern that appears to partially interfere with the decay process. It doesn't stop it, it doesn't reverse it on its own, but it seems to slow the unraveling, the way a hand pressed against a wound slows the bleeding without closing it. That's a thread, Damon said. It's a very thin thread, she said. I can follow a thin thread, he said, and he meant it. He spent the next 4 days not sleeping. He worked through the garrison's communication channels to reach xenobiologists on 3 different worlds, calling in favors from soldiers he had served with who had since moved into research positions. He contacted 2 black market neural engineers whose names he had gathered years ago in a situation he had never fully explained in any official report. He read everything Oren had. Asked questions that kept her at her desk until dawn, and cross-referenced data models that had never been placed in the same room before because nobody had thought there was a reason to. The alien soldiers watched all of this with growing fascination. The Oren fighter Grev had taken to quietly observing Damon's activities with the focused attention of a field researcher watching an unfamiliar animal do something outside the expected behavioral range. He began reporting to the other soldiers at mealtimes not with alarm but with the flat and careful tone of a person narrating something they did not fully understand but felt was important to document. He has contacted 9 separate research sources in 4 days. Grev reported one evening to a small group in the mess hall. He is connecting data models from fields that have no established relationship with each other. He has averaged less than 3 hours of sleep per night. Why does he not rest? One of the Thelk engineers asked. Grev considered this with genuine seriousness. I believe he thinks that if he stops, time will move without him and he will not be able to catch it again. The table was silent for a moment. Nobody had a response that felt adequate. Elder Sorvith came to Oren's lab on the 2nd day. He did not knock. He simply appeared in the doorway with 2 Varelsai officers behind him and stood there, watching Damon at the data screen with the expression of someone who was trying to remain composed in the presence of something they found deeply confusing. Sergeant Hale, the elder said, I have come to ask you again to consider what you are doing, not to the commander, but to yourself. You are burning through your own hours in pursuit of something our greatest doctors have called impossible. This is not wisdom. Damon finished reading the line on his screen and then turned and looked at the elder with a direct and respectful gaze. Elder Sorvith, he said, I understand what your tradition teaches and I do not say it is wrong for your people, but I am not Varelsai, where I come from. You don't stop trying every door just because the statistics say the doors are all closed. You keep going until you find the one the statistics missed. One of the Varelsai officers behind Sorvith said something quietly in their own language. The words translated roughly as he believes it is actually possible. The tone was not mocking, it was something much closer to wonder. And meanwhile, in the med bay above them, something quiet was happening that nobody had predicted. Ethan's neural decay readings had stopped accelerating. They had not improved, they had not reversed, but they had leveled off at a point where every medical model said they should have continued to fall. Varelsai doctors reviewed the data twice, then a 3rd time, and could not produce an explanation that fit their existing understanding. Tail added a note to the bottom of her evening report. The only variable that had changed in the patient's environment in the past 4 days was the consistent and extended presence of Sergeant Hale during late hours. She did not know what to make of it, so she passed it to Oren, and added a 2nd note at the very bottom that said simply, this should not be happening. Oren received that report at 2 in the morning and sat very still at her desk for a long time. She pulled up the 3 outlier cases again and looked at them not as data points to be filed, but as something trying to tell her something that the medical establishment had not wanted to hear. She built new models, stranger models, models that combined neural resonance theory with decay mechanics in ways that had no published precedent. At 3 in the morning she found something, a pathway, theoretical and fragile, a possibility that lived at the very edge of what the available science could support. It was not a cure in the conventional sense. It was something older and stranger and far more costly, and when she fully understood what she was looking at, she set down her cup and stared at the screen for a very long time with the expression of a person who has found the answer to the question and realized that the answer is going to break someone's heart. She sent Damon a message. Come to the lab. I found something. It is not good news, but it is something and you need to hear it now. He was there in less than 5 minutes, still in his uniform, eyes sharp, moving like a man who had been waiting for exactly this message. He sat down across from her and looked at her face and knew immediately from the look in her eyes that whatever she had found was going to cost something. Tell me, he said. Oren took a breath. I need you to understand, she said carefully, that what I am about to describe is theoretical, dangerous, and has never been successfully completed on a living patient of any species. Tell me, he said again. The same two words, the same voice, the same absolute stillness. And up in the medbay, Ethan's monitor flickered once more. That same faint and unexplained spike of neural activity, there and gone like a candle in a wind that had not quite managed to put it out, yet the lab felt smaller than usual that night. Oren had cleared the secondary screen and pulled up a single diagram, a web of intersecting lines that represented, in simplified visual form, the neural architecture of two living beings placed in close and deliberate contact. The diagram looked almost beautiful in the blue light of the screen, the way dangerous things sometimes did. The procedure is called a neural resonance transfusion, she said. She spoke slowly and chose every word with care. It was theorized 40 years ago by a human researcher named Dr. Calloway, who published one paper, was rejected by every major medical institution in the coalition, and retired quietly. The paper was never properly studied because it described something that most of the scientific community considered to be practically impossible and ethically indefensible. Damon looked at the diagram. What does it do? It creates a direct bridge between two neural systems, Oren said. The donor and the patient are connected through a set of resonance conduits, and through that connection, the donor's living neural energy is used to manually rebuild the pathways that the decay has destroyed. The donor essentially pours a part of their own neural architecture into the patient and uses it to replace what is missing. That sounds like it works, Damon said. It does work, in theory, she said, but the cost to the donor is severe. The process forces the donor's nervous system to operate far beyond its normal capacity for a sustained period. It burns through neural reserves that cannot be easily replaced. In the best-case scenario, the donor loses years from their functional lifespan. In moderate cases, the neurological damage is significant and permanent, and in the most severe cases, she paused and looked at him steadily, the donor does not survive the procedure. The lab was very quiet. How severe is Ethan's case? Damon asked. Oren looked at him for a moment before she answered. The most severe, she said. He nodded slowly. So the donor would most likely die. Most likely, she said. The probability of donor survival in a case at her stage of decay is, based on Calloway's models and the data I have run tonight, somewhere below 20%. Damon was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the diagram on the screen, at the two intersecting webs of lines, one giving and one receiving, and the place in the middle where they met and became briefly and terribly the same thing. Who else knows about this? He asked. Right now, just us, she said. I want you to call a full medical meeting, he said. Everyone in the garrison with any medical or scientific background. I want this presented to all of them. Oren looked at him carefully. Damon, I need to be clear about what I think you are planning. Call the meeting, he said, and his voice was not harsh, it was simply decided. The meeting took place the following morning in the garrison central room. It was a large cold space used for briefings, and it had never felt quite as heavy as it did that morning when Oren stood at the front and walked every person in the room through the procedure, through the requirements, and through the cost. The alien doctors and officers listened in their various ways, the Varel Psi with their hands folded and their expressions composed, the Oren fighters with their broad shoulders and watchful eyes, the Thelk engineers clicking softly to each other in the way they did when they were processing something new. The humans stood near the back and said nothing. When Oren finished, the room was still for a long moment. Then Elder Sorva spoke. You are describing the deliberate consumption of one living being's neural essence for the benefit of another, he said. This is not medicine. This is something our philosophy does not have a category for. It would be like asking someone to give away the part of themselves that makes them themselves. That is correct, Oren said. And you need a volunteer, Sorvath said, not as a question. Yes. The room stayed still, not a guilty stillness, not a cowardly one. It was the stillness of people who genuinely could not locate within themselves a framework for what they were being asked to consider. The Varel Psi did not volunteer because their culture had no concept of self-destruction as an act of love. It was simply not a thing their minds were shaped to reach for. The Oren fighters were warriors by nature and sacrifice in battle was known to them, but this was different, slower, and stranger. The Thelk engineers ran the numbers quickly and went very quiet. The Drevany scouts did not move at all. 30 seconds passed, then a full minute. Damon stepped forward from the back of the room. I'll do it, he said. The room did not make a sound, not for a long moment, and then it seemed as though every person in it took a breath at the same time. Oren turned to face him. Damon. I said I'll do it, he said, still calm, still decided. One of the Varel Psi officers, a tall woman named Vel, stepped forward. Sergeant Hale, she said carefully. I want to make sure you understand what the probability modeling indicates. The likelihood that you will not survive this procedure is. I heard the numbers, he said. Then you understand that you are volunteering to most likely die, she said. Yes, he said. Vel stared at him. Why? Damon looked at her for a moment. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of someone trying to find the simplest and most honest version of a very large thing. Because I can, he said. And because she can't, and that seems like enough of a reason to me. Another officer, the Orin named Grev, moved forward and picked up a data pad from the table. He had pulled Damon's service record without anyone asking him to, and he began to read from it in a flat and deliberate voice. 14 years of continuous service, 9 separate combat deployments, 4 citations for actions under fire, a commendation for pulling 3 soldiers out of a collapsed structure on Myra Station, and then, more quietly, 1 daughter, age 7, currently residing on Earth with her mother, weekly communication logs, unbroken, without exception, for 3 years. The room was very still when Grev finished reading. You have a child, Grev said, not as an accusation, just as a fact he wanted Damon to confirm was real. I do, Damon said. And you are still volunteering? Yes. Grev set the pad down. The look on his broad face was one that none of the Orin present had a word for. It was not confusion exactly, and it was not admiration exactly. It was the expression of a being who has just encountered something that exists outside every category they were born with. Elder Sorvith had been silent since Damon stepped forward. He was looking at the human soldier with his pale eyes and an expression that was slowly changing from composure to something much less certain. You have everything to live for, he said at last, and the words came out sounding less like a statement and more like a genuine attempt to understand. Damon glanced toward the corridor that led to the medbay. So does she, he said. The room had no answer for that. Orin looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright and her voice was level when she spoke, but the words cost her something. If we do this, she said, I need you to know that I will do everything in my power to keep you alive. Every resource I have, every protocol I can build. I will not stop working until there is nothing left to try. I know, he said. That's why I trust you to run it. The preparations began that afternoon. Orin worked without stopping, building the resonance conduit configuration from scratch using equipment that had never been assembled in this combination. The alien medical staff assisted without being asked, quietly and carefully, as if the gravity of what they were participating in had rearranged something in how they moved. And in the medbay, Ethan continued to fade. Her readings were slower now than they should have been, still held at that strange plateau that could not be medically explained, as if some part of her, some deep and stubborn thread of what she had been, was refusing to release completely, waiting for something it did not have a name for yet. By evening the Condor array was ready. By the time the garrison's cold lights dimmed for the night, everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Damon sat alone in the corridor outside the medbay for a while before he went in. He took out his comm unit and recorded a short message. For his daughter, he did not tell her what he was about to do. He just told her that she was the best thing he had ever done, and that whatever happened, she should know that. He sent it and put the comm unit away and sat quietly for another minute. Then he stood up and went inside. The medbay had been rearranged entirely. 2 platforms now stood side by side, Ethan's original, and a second one brought in for Damon. Between them, Orin had constructed the resonance condor array, a web of slender silver cables and softly glowing nodes that connected the 2 platforms at their midpoints. It looked delicate, like something built from spider thread and starlight, and it hummed at a frequency that sat just below the range of normal hearing, felt more than heard, a vibration in the chest and behind the eyes. The alien medical staff had come in full. Tail and the other Varelside doctors stood at the monitoring stations, their expressions carefully neutral. The Orin medic checked connections on the secondary systems without being asked. Even the 2 Thelk engineers had found a reason to be present, standing near the back wall and pretending to review something on their data pads while actually watching everything. Elder Sorvith stood near the door. He had not been asked to come and he had not announced his intention to. He was simply there, very still, very quiet. Damon lay down on the second platform without ceremony. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Orin, who was standing beside him with her hands moving through the final calibration sequence. Her face was composed and professional and her hands were completely steady, but her eyes were doing something that she was working hard to keep out of the rest of her expression. Ready? She asked. Yes, he said. She began the connection sequence. The conduit nodes lit one by one, each small light a pale blue that brightened as the system came online. The silver cables warmed against Damon's skin at the points of contact, not painfully, just present, and then, slowly, and then all at once, the bridge opened. The first thing Damon felt was pressure. Not physical pain but something deeper, a pulling sensation behind his eyes and at the base of his skull, as if something large and gentle was asking his nervous system to open a door it had never opened before. He kept his breathing even and let it happen. The monitors at his station immediately started showing elevated activity. His heart rate climbed. His neural output spiked dramatically as the conduit began drawing from his system. Oren watched the numbers without blinking and made small adjustments to the array with precise and careful hands. Across from him, Ethan's readings changed. Just slightly at first, just a faint brightening in the patterns that the decay had been erasing. But it was there, measurable, real, and the Varelsai Dr. Tail looked at her monitor and then looked again and made a very small sound that was not quite a word. The alien officers watching from the walls did not speak. They barely moved. They watched a human soldier's body work itself toward its limits in silence, and something in the quality of that silence changed as the minutes passed. It became less like observation and more like witness. An hour in, Damon's muscles began to respond. His back arched slightly and his hands gripped the sides of the platform as a wave of strain moved through his entire nervous system. It felt like every nerve in his body was being played at once, like an instrument being pushed far past the volume it was designed for. He did not make a sound, he just held on. Oren adjusted the conduit flow and the wave passed. "Still with me," she said quietly. "Still here," he said through his teeth. 2 hours in, something changed. The physical world around Damon did not disappear. He was still aware of the platform under his back, still aware of the hum of the machines and the soft sound of Oren's voice reading numbers. But he was also somewhere else, in the way that deep sleep sometimes takes a person somewhere else while leaving their body behind. He was standing in a place that had no clear ground and no clear sky. The light around him was the color of deep water, blue-green and wavering, and across from him, standing very still, was Ethan. She looked as she must have looked before, tall and silver-boned, her eyes pale and sharp, her posture the posture of a person who had commanded armies and had never entirely stopped. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and layered and not at all what he had expected. "You should not be here," she said. "I know," he said. "I came anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. "I have seen your records, Sergeant Hale. I know who you are. I know you have a child who needs you. I know you have years of service and years of living still ahead of you. What you are doing is not rational." "No," he agreed. "Then why are you doing it?" He thought about how to answer that. In the waking world he might have said something short and deflective, something soldierly. But here, in this strange in-between space where two nervous systems were braided together and there was no room for anything that wasn't true, he just said it plainly. "Because watching you disappear was not something I was willing to do. Because you were worth fighting for and no one else was going to fight. Because sometimes a person just sees another person going out like a light and they cannot walk away from that, no matter what the numbers say." Ethan was very still. The wavering blue-green light moved around her and through her like water. "That is not a military reason," she said at last. "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him for a long time, and then something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, the way a window opens to let in air that the room has needed for a while. "I have been watching you from very far away," she said quietly. "Since the first night you came and sat beside me. I could not see clearly, I could not hear properly, but I felt it, something in your presence, like a fire very far away that I was trying to walk toward." "I know," he said. "I could feel you trying." She looked at his face and in the strange clear light of this place she could see things that the waking world covered up. She could see all of it, the stubbornness and the gentleness, the grief and the steadiness, the unreasonable and specific kind of love that humans carried around in them like a second heartbeat. The kind that did not ask permission and did not calculate consequences and did not stop just because the situation called for stopping. "You are going to hurt yourself very badly doing this," she said, and now the composure in her voice had something underneath it that sounded like real pain. "I know," he said. "Don't push me away." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I am almost finished," he said, and in the waking world, the monitors at his station had begun alarming. His heart rate had climbed to a point that made Oren's voice go sharp and fast. She was adjusting, recalibrating, doing everything she could with steady and furious hands. Damon's neural output was burning at levels that the conduit system had not been designed to sustain. The array was holding but only just, and across from him, Ethan's readings were climbing in the other direction. Each pathway, the decay had dissolved, slowly reappearing on the monitor like roads being rebuilt after a storm. The alien officers at the walls were no longer pretending to be calm. The Varelsai doctors were working their monitors at full speed, their composure cracked open by the sheer speed of what they were watching. Grev had moved forward without thinking and was standing close to Damon's platform with both huge fists tight at his sides, watching the human's face with an expression that had gone past understanding and come out the other side into something raw. Elder Sorvith stood at the door and said nothing, but he was watching Damon with his pale eyes wide open and his old and practiced stillness entirely gone. In the blue-green space, Damon felt himself getting lighter, not in a good way, in the way that things get lighter when they are losing what holds them together. The edges of the space around him were going soft and indistinct, and his legs did not feel entirely real under him. Ethan stepped forward, fast, decisive, the movement of a commander who had made a decision. She closed the distance between them and placed both of her silver-bone hands on his face with a care that was almost too much to look at. "Stay," she said, and the word came out like an order, like the kind of order that had been earned and meant to be obeyed. He looked at her. "Working on it," he said. And in the waking world, for the space of 10 seconds, every monitor in the medbay screamed the monitors stopped screaming because Orin made them stop. She cut the conduit flow manually, bypassed 2 safety locks, and rerouted the remaining resonance current through a narrower channel that she had calculated on the spot in the 11 seconds she had before the system would have shut itself down completely. Her hands did not shake. They had not shaken once through the entire procedure, though she would notice later that her fingernails had cut clean crescents into her palms from how hard she had been holding herself together. The room came back to something like quiet, not actual quiet, because the machines were still running and the alien medical staff was still moving at speed, but the worst of the noise was gone. Ethan's readings were high and stable and climbing in the right direction. Every pathway on her neural map that the decay had been dismantling was lit and holding, newly rebuilt, bright as fresh wire. Damon's readings were low and falling and very, very still. He was breathing. That was the first thing Orin checked. That was the thing she had to confirm before she could do anything else. Yes, breathing, shallow but steady, heart still beating, irregular but present, neural output almost flat, dropped to a level that the monitors flagged in deep red because it had no healthy reference point to compare against. "He is alive," Orin said out loud, not to anyone specific, just into the room because the room needed to hear it. Nobody cheered. It was not that kind of moment, but something shifted in the quality of the silence. Something that had been very tight in every chest in that room released by a small and careful degree. The procedure had worked. Ethan would live. And Damon would not wake up. Not that day, not the next. He lay on the platform with the soft machines keeping watch over him and his face completely still, and the garrison moved around him in a new and different way, a way that had been changed by what they had watched. On the second day, Elder Sorvith came to the medbay alone, without ceremony, without the composure that he always carried like a second skin. He stood beside Damon's platform for a long time and looked at the still face of the human soldier and said nothing out loud but moved his hands in a gesture that the Varelsai used only for the living. Not the rite of accepted ending, which released, but an older gesture, one used for children and the young, one that meant something closer to hold on, the world still needs you in it. Grev came on the third day and sat in the chair that Damon had always used when he came to sit beside Ethan. The big Orin fighter sat in it for 3 hours without speaking, just present, just there, and when he left he did not explain himself to anyone. On the fourth day, something happened that Orin had not anticipated and the aliens had not proposed to each other and no one had discussed. It simply began, the way necessary things sometimes begin, without announcement. Tail came to Orin with a question. Was there a secondary procedure, a smaller and safer version of the resonance transfer, something that could be done in a minor way by multiple donors to stabilize what remained of Damon's neural architecture without the risks of the full procedure? Orin looked at the question for a long moment. It was not in any of the literature she had studied. She built the model from scratch in 4 hours and the answer was yes, theoretically, yes, if the contributions were small enough and numerous enough and the donors were willing. Every alien soldier in the garrison volunteered. Not some of them, all of them. Vrelsai officers and Orin fighters and Thelk engineers and the 2 Drevany scouts who had not spoken to anyone in weeks and had not been expected to speak now. They formed a line outside Orin's lab the next morning and they each gave a small and carefully measured portion of neural energy through a simplified version of the conduit. Array, minor enough to cause nothing more than a brief headache and a day of tiredness, but in aggregate, across all of them, enough to do something real. When it was done, one of the younger Vrelsai officers asked Orin quietly what humans called this kind of act. This giving of small pieces from many to hold up one. Orin thought about it for a moment. "We call it not letting go," she said. The officer repeated the phrase carefully in his own language. There was no direct translation, but he found the words that came closest. They meant something like refusing the end together. Ethan was present for all of it. She had woken fully on the morning after the procedure, which was itself something that the HFY doctors could not quite process: full recovery, complete neural restoration, no residual decay traces on any scan. She had sat up on the platform and looked around the room at the people in it and said nothing for a long time, which everyone present understood was not absence but the opposite, a very full kind of silence. She had gone to Damon's side within the first hour of waking. She had stood beside his platform the way he had stood beside hers, and she had not left it for more than a few hours at a time in the weeks that followed. She stood watch over him the way a soldier stands watch, with purpose and steadiness and no sign of impatience. If the irony of it struck her, she did not say so. The alien soldiers watched this too, and something about watching her stand over him the way he had sat beside her rearranged things in them in a way that was hard to name. Grev said to one of the Thelk engineers one evening that he thought he was beginning to understand humans, and the Thelk engineer clicked twice in the way that meant respectful disagreement and said that he thought they were only beginning to understand that they did not understand humans, which was an entirely different and much more important thing. 3 weeks and 2 days after the procedure, Damon opened his eyes. The med bay was quiet. It was early morning, the thin pale light of Velkara coming through the small window at a low angle. The machines were running their soft rhythms, and standing beside his platform, silver-boned and straight-backed and watching him with pale eyes that had not quite managed to hold their usual composure, was Ethan. He blinked, looked at the ceiling, looked at her, looked at the ceiling again. His voice came out rough and thin, like something that had not been used in a long time and was finding its way back. "You look better," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change, but something moved through her eyes that she did not try to hide. "You look terrible," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was not much of one, but it was something. She reached forward and placed her hand over his. The silver bones of her fingers were visible through her skin and her grip was careful and deliberate. She held his hand and looked at him, and then she said something in Varelsai, a long phrase, low and clear, spoken the way important things are spoken, without hurry. He did not understand it. He looked at her face for a translation. She did not give one immediately. She simply held his gaze with the same steady intensity she had brought to every command she had ever given. And then she said, in plain standard, the words that came closest to what she had said in her own language: "You are now a part of what I am. This is not gratitude. This is a fact." He looked at her for a moment, and then, despite everything, despite the weeks of nothing and the neural damage and the thin voice and the ceiling he was still mostly staring at, he smiled. It was a small smile, not triumphant, not dramatic, just a person being glad that something worked out, quietly and completely glad, in the specific way that humans were glad when they had done the unreasonable thing and it had turned out to matter. Across the Coalition communication network that week, the incident report from Velkara moved through military and scientific and diplomatic channels like a stone dropped in still water. It was passed from post to post, from species to species, flagged and reviewed and discussed in rooms across a dozen worlds. Some read it with confusion, some with discomfort, some with a kind of cautious fascination that they could not quite justify. In the chambers of the Galactic Council, a senator from a species nearly 3,000 years older than humanity reviewed the report twice and then composed a formal memo. It was brief and it was addressed to all member governments. It read, "We have been assessing the human species on the wrong criteria. We have measured their weapons and their numbers and their technology and found them unremarkable. We have not measured what they are willing to do for each other, and for strangers, and for people they have known only weeks, and that is the only measurement that matters. The record from Velkara describes a being who faced near certain death not in battle, not for territory, not for ideology, but because another person was fading and he decided that was not acceptable. Revise all prior assessments of the human species, do it immediately, and take seriously what it means that they are out here with the rest of us." The memo was logged, archived, and forwarded. And on Velkara, in a garrison that had been changed by what it witnessed, a human soldier learned slowly and carefully how to walk. Again, with an alien commander at his side who had decided, without making any announcement of it, that wherever he was going, she was going too. Some debts, she had concluded, could not be paid, they could only be carried, and she had decided she did not mind carrying this one. Not even a little.